Earlier this year, the International Energy Agency released its net zero by 2050 policy scenario, and that kind of changed everyone's view of economic modeling, climate modeling for the future. Well, now the Canadian Energy Regulator has released its Energy Future 2021, and it does not have an explicit net zero by 2050 scenario. It doesn't model what has to be done to meet Canada's climate commitments, and that's being roundly criticized by environmental groups. So I'm going to talk to Nichole Dusyk from Pembina about the modeling. So welcome to the interview, Nichole.
Hello, thanks for having me on.
Now, Nichole, this seems really odd, given all of the attention that the IEA report has generated and raised expectations, frankly. I mean, it has raised the bar for this type of analysis. The Canadian government, the Trudeau government, has made a big deal out of its commitment to meet net zero by 2050. It's raised its, it's brought in some tougher climate policies. How do we explain the absence of that scenario in the recent the Energy Future 2021?
Well, I mean, I can't explain the absence of the scenario. What I can say is that it really is doing a disservice to Canadians. It's frankly difficult to understand what kind of policies we need in order to meet our climate commitments when we're not modeling a pathway towards those commitments. So what we have with what the CER produced last week is scenarios that show, vaguely the trajectory we're currently on, and an indication that that trajectory does not match with our climate commitments. But we have no indication of what we need to do in order to meet those commitments. We can look to what the IEA has produced, but we don't have modeling, Canadian specific modeling from the federal government that would show us how we can achieve those commitments and how we can align our energy system with those commitments.
Right, and we should say that the two scenarios they did model, one is the current policy scenario, which is just everything pretty much goes along as it is today, out to 2050. Then they have the evolving policy scenario where policy evolves on the kind of on a trajectory that's determined by today. And then they, acknowledging that they didn't do the kind of scenario modeling that we're talking about, they said, but here's 6 scenarios around electricity use and the electricity system in Canada. I didn't understand why they did that. So what should they have done? Like what kind of a model should they have provided?
Well, they should have provided a model that was very similar to what the IEA produced in its net zero by 2050 report. So particularly a model that assumes that the world acts to limit global climate change. So we call that a 1.5 aligned scenario, a scenario that assumes collectively the world limits global climate change to 1.5 degrees. That scenario then should also achieve net zero emissions domestically in Canada by 2050. Those two things are not necessarily the same. Reaching net zero by 2050 does not assume that the world limits global climate change to 1.5 degrees. So we do need both of those things collectively together. And then, I would say certainly we need modeling around the commitments that the government has made. So they have made a commitment to cap oil and gas sector emissions at current levels and put that cap on a declining schedule to net zero by 2050. They've made a commitment to a non-emitting electricity grid by 2035. Those are key commitments that will pretty drastically change what energy looks like in Canada. Now, they did do the net zero modeling for the electricity sector, which is useful. And I suspect that is a way to start building up the model that they need in order to do the kind of modeling we would like to see. And they started with the electricity sector, but even those models, not a single one models net zero by 2035, which is what the government has committed to. So even there, it is exploring some of the factors that will influence what electricity generation will look like and how we can reduce emissions from that sector. But the time scale is all wrong for that. And so it actually doesn't show us what we need to know in terms of if we push that back to have a non-emitting grid by 2035, that's going to change the mix of technologies because we're going to have to scale up faster. And we can't wait for some of the technologies that they are anticipating will come online post 2040 or around 2040. In order to get to that net zero by 2050, we're going to need that, we're going to need to work with the technologies that we have at hand today and that we know are commercial today.
Yeah, I've been arguing for a while that the lack of Canadian attention to its electricity system in a net zero world, or our efforts to get to net zero, is a problem, because we're not talking about the changes that we doubling or tripling our electricity generation. We're not talking about the amount of transmission that capacity that has to build. We're not talking about how we're going to build out infrastructure in neighborhoods to handle electric vehicles. This is not part of the conversation, and yet that's implicit, sometimes explicit, in all of the federal government's policies. It's the trend that's happening around the world. And so I would agree with you. I think that the modeling, the electricity system modeling that the CER has done here is a good first step. But it's like, okay, you need to take it now to the next stage and do the proper modeling, the full net zero by 2050 modeling, so we can see how all of these pieces fit together.
Yes, and importantly, we need to have net zero electricity modeled by 2035, or frankly earlier. I think there's a case to be made that it's worth doing some modeling to see if we could get non-emitting electricity across the country earlier than 2035. We already are at 82%. Is it possible to reach non-emitting electricity by 2030? And what would that do in terms of the potential for decarbonization in other sectors like transport and buildings, if we can rely on a non-emitting electricity grid even earlier than 2035?
Yeah, it seems like Canada's taking a very piecemeal approach to this, and there's a lack of leadership. And it's not that this Canadian Energy Regulator should provide leadership necessarily. That should come from other quarters like politicians and business leaders and civil society leaders. But they're kind of they underpin some of our understanding that we need this information in order to have the conversations. If you don't have data, if you don't have analysis, we have no basis on which to have a solid conversation as a nation. I think that's what disturbs me the most about this is we just have this lackadaisical attitude that, we'll get to it when we get to it.
Yeah, that's exactly the point, is that we need to understand the pace and the scale of the energy transition that's ahead of us. And we need data to understand that. Now, keeping in mind that what the CER is producing are scenarios, and they are only scenarios. So they are projections under a particular set of conditions of what the energy system could look like. Now, the way that the CER does its modeling currently, because it has so few scenarios, they're often talked about in a way that assumes that this is, a forecast. This is what's going to happen. But we know very well that climate change is already causing incredible uncertainty in terms of economic activity, in terms of infrastructure. We've all just experienced the pandemic. We know that there's so much uncertainty that we can't control. And so we need to understand that these are just scenarios, and that if the CER were to produce a 1.5 degree aligned scenario, it would only be a scenario. It's not going to tell us what we need to do exactly, but it would show us, what areas we need to look at, where we need to have further investment, what kind of technologies, we might have gaps in investment in, what are the emerging industries we need to support, where do we need policy and financial support. And quite frankly, what are the communities that are going to see a decline in labor market, right? And where do we need to support workers and communities in the energy transition? So this, all of this information is needed in order to ensure that we actually can reach our commitments, our climate commitments, and that we can ensure that investment is aligned with those commitments. as well as then support Canadians in the energy transition.
Right. Just to wrap up this conversation, Nichole, let's take another look at this, or let's look at this issue from another angle, which is the opportunities presented by the energy transition and the switch to basically electrify the global economy. And what isn't electrified will probably switch over to low carbon fuels like hydrogen. So this restructuring of the global energy system is not only a challenge from the climate point of view, it's also a tremendous opportunity from the economic point of view. And if Canada is going to take advantage of this, we need to know what those opportunities are, the scale of the opportunities, how much capital is required, where should those industries go? Are we going to have battery plants in every province of Canada? Are we going to, where do we need, abundant clean energy so that we can clean up the steel industry? Those so many of those questions like that we just don't have answers for because we don't have the analysis that points us in the right direction.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So we know that there's a global energy transition underway. The CER admits in its report that global oil demand, LNG exports are key uncertainties in their scenarios. And we know that if the world actually acts towards limiting climate change, we're going to see, we're not, Canada's energy scenario is not going to look anything like what they have shown us in this report. So we know those uncertainties exist. We also know that an energy transition is underway and we need to plan for it. So effectively, we need to plan for climate success. We need to plan to have a thriving, clean energy economy in Canada. We need to ensure that we have the industrial policy in place to support that economy. And we need to make sure that we have supports in place for workers and communities that are going to be affected. And we know that that's the case, right? That the energy transition will disproportionately affect particular communities in Canada. That is no secret. And so, we need to plan for that so that transition is orderly and it's smooth and it's not disruptive or overly disruptive in a way that, is devastating to communities.
Well, Nichole, thank you very much. And I think we need to have more of these kinds of conversations because I don't think as a rule, Canadians and many of our political and business leaders don't understand the scale of disruption in the global energy system and what it's doing to the global economy. Where again, Canadians are muddling through rather than being leaders. And the danger in that is that we get left behind. And that then down the road impacts the quality of life that we have, the prosperity or lack of prosperity that we have. And and I think we need to look to the Canadian Energy Regulator to do a better job so that we can, it informs the conversations that we need to have. Anyway, enough of my rant. Thank you very much, Nichole. Really appreciate this.
Thank you. It was great talking to you.